Olá, eu sou Joana de Bairros, and I'm going to be talking about Portuguese custard tarts. But a little different from the traditional ones that you might expect to see if you're travelling through the streets of Lisbon today, which are called Pastéis de Nata. The ones I'm going to make are called Pastéis de Leite. So they are the grandfather of the famous Pastéis de Nata, and they feature the recipe for Pastéis de Leite feature in a 15th century cookbook, which I'll also be talking about. I will take you through how we make these particular types of custard tarts, and they are absolutely delicious.
So the recipe for the pastillas de leite came from a 15th and early 16th century collection of recipes written in Portuguese, and they are known as either O Livro de Cozinha de Isabel Maria Infanta Maria de Portugal or Tratado de Cozinha Portuguesa do século 15th century. So we think they were taken from Portugal to Naples by Maria, who was the niece of King João, and when she married Alessandro Farnese. Um, it is unusual to find a recipe book written in Portuguese in Naples, and that's why they think that there is this connection there. If you're in the last class by Elsie, she was talking about this particular marriage in her discussion of the wedding celebration, of the particular wedding celebration and the mounted horse tournaments that took place there. So it's quite a nice way to link into this class. This is the earliest known Portuguese cookbook. There is another one which is sort of mid to late 17th century, but there is nothing before this. And in terms of the ECA period, there's nothing else, which makes this a very, very valuable book. And this is Donna Maria here. It's lovely. It's her dress beautiful. I love the beautiful belt she's got as well. So pastillas de nata or late. Now, when you go, and I hope all of you do at some point in time, go and visit Lisbon if you aren't already have been already. You will go and get a pastel de nata, and it is a really important kind of, I guess, tradition as a tourist in Lisbon is going and getting one of those, usually from Belém in Lisbon, and usually connected to the Jerónimos Monastery. We'll come to that in a moment. Interestingly, I found a reference from quite a well-known modern Portuguese chef called Virgilio Gomes, and he comments about this particular recipe from this cookbook of Isabella's being the avô, the ancestor of the modern famous pastel de nata. In Portuguese, nata just means cream, and late is milk. So it's slightly different. The biggest difference, however, in the recipes is that the modern Portuguese nata has got a puff pastry, and the modern version, I've interpreted the 16th century version is more of a sort of sweet short crust kind of pastry. So the first recipe we have for a nata is from the 19th century. And what you get in Portugal is this tradition of religious houses, particularly convents, producing sweets. And there are tours you can do in Porto where you go around all the different old convents and try their famous sweets. I think it sounds like an amazing thing to do. And for the monastery and the convent in Belém, the Jerónimos Monastery, which is very, very famous in Lisbon. Belém was the place where all the Portuguese caravels and galleons went went to sort of explore the New World, colonize it. Yes, lots of different words you could use to describe that. But Belém was really a really important center for this. They went out from Belém, they went out into the world, and Belém became very much celebrated as that place. And when you go today, there's the great Jerónimos Monastery, which was built by King Manuel, this was basically his period, was the start of the 16th century. And he built the Jerónimos Monastery as kind of a way of showing off to the world about Portuguese supremacy. And it is interesting that this major part of Portuguese sort of culinary history has come from Belém, which I mean, wherever you go in the world, you often will find bakeries advertising Portuguese custard tarts. Some of the best ones I ever had were actually in a funny little place in Streatham in the south of London. There's also, where I live in New Zealand, there's a Portuguese bakery up in Auckland that's their big thing is doing Pastel de Nata, and you can buy boxes of them and they send them all around New Zealand. So it is kind of like one of the things that is part of Portuguese food history. But definitely the idea of the Pastel de Nata is more of a 19th century thing. Probably that's the first time that a much older recipe was written down. One of the reasons they think that it came from the convents is the convents often did a lot of the laundry. And as part of them doing the laundry, they'd use egg whites as part of the starchy of clothing. They had all these leftover egg yolks and they turned those into custard to make these tarts. Whether or not that is actually factually true or not, I don't know. It does make sense though. It's about not wasting things. The issue with our recipe is translation for an English audience. There is one translation in English I have found, which is found on the Medieval Cookery site. As I have got into my study of the Portuguese language, however, this has become more and more problematic because what you have got in the 1960s, there were two different versions of this particular recipe book in Portuguese. One in 1963 and one in 1967. The major issue with the 1963 one is they wrote it for a Brazilian audience. So they took the traditional Portuguese, they translated it into Brazilian Portuguese, which has some fairly major differences to European Portuguese, and then they added sort of modern quantities into the recipe as well. So when you are trying to get back to the heart of what the 16th century recipe would be like, this translation doesn't work very well. So for an English audience, it is going to cause you some major issues. And for me, in terms of what I want from my cookery, is what would it have looked like in period? And sometimes I will use modern techniques to get there, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But I want to kind of get the sense of what was it, how the original recipe was constructed and what they wrote. And it is really hard to do that from that particular 1963 version. Somewhat hilariously, I have found online a facsimile of the 1967 Portuguese edition, which was written for a European Portuguese market. And whoever who was writing it was, I think, firstly had quite a big opinion of their own ability and really, really, really did not like the 1963 version at all. And it describes it as now impecável, which basically means not impeccable, like not correct, and goes on to say it's not possible to know a good part of the manuscript from this particular Brazilian one because it's not right. And it sort of goes on to say, sadly, it was, things were changed in this. And certainly, as I have gone through, the best original version of the recipes as they were written down in the late 16th century is this particular one online. And I need to do a bit more unpacking of it. But it is certainly, it does actually directly transcribe the recipes in a way that other ones don't. The version I have used for this particular class, though, is a modern PDF, and this is from around about 2020, so it is fairly recent, and you can download it from the website that's linked to here, and it is €4.99, so it is incredibly cheap. So it's about €5. So in New Zealand money, that's about $9 New Zealand dollars, so about $5 US. It's not a lot of money at all. It is much closer to the original, the 1963 version, and it does modernize the Portuguese, but not in a grating, I'm changing the recipe entirely kind of way. I'll talk a wee bit about it when we get to them. And when I decided I wanted to have a really good go at translating this recipe, with my limited Portuguese, I felt this was the best version for me to use. So this is the this is the Portuguese recipe from the Amas cook, and this is just what it says on there. If you look at this and you look at that first words, which is levas ao lume, so which is basically means take to the oven, and then you look at this one. This is the as it was written down. You can see it's slightly different. It says tomaso, and it basically means the same thing, take to the oven. But the way that the language works in this particular version is very much you should take to the oven and you should do this. And I think what this Amas Cook one has done is just made those instructions a bit more direct. So take this, beat this, rather than you should take this and you should beat this. So it does just make it a bit easier when you're trying to translate it. But this is what the original version looked like. And isn't the handwriting just beautiful? I have horrific handwriting, quite frankly, and I admire people who can write like this. Interestingly, because it says Leite there again, it is in a section of recipes in this particular book, which are all milk-based recipes. And there's also quite a big section of egg-based recipes as well. And even in modern Portuguese cooking, eggs are a really, really kind of central ingredient in Portuguese food. And milk is as well. You get lots of egg and milk kind of recipes as part of Portuguese 21st century food. So in English, what this actually says is take to the fire to boil half an aratel of water without salt. And it's very interesting it specifies without salt. When boiled, pour in half an aratel of milk and half aratel of sugar, which will make half a dozen pastries, or half a dozen pastries. In a dish, a scudella, pour in flour, a dozen whole eggs and beat them well. Dissolve the mixture of milk to form a fine batter. Pour this batter into the syrup and then take to the fire. When it is cooked, take it off the fire. Prepare a dough that should take a little sugar, 2 egg yolks and butter and beat it. It actually just literally says beat it. And Joana, my tutor, explained to me that if you want to punch someone, you would use that word that means beat it. To make the forms of pastry, take away to the oven until they're half cooked, then pour in the filling of milk and a little butter on the top. Take to the oven until they are cooked on top. So there's some interesting things in here in terms of period recipes. Firstly, as there actually are quantities, which you don't get in a lot of recipes, period recipes. You know, that famous one of till it be enough, or take some of this and take some of that. So they specify very much in aratel, which amas.com says is about 4.59 kilos. When I was doing my own version of the recipe, I reduced this, and I also reduced the number of eggs. So you had 200 grams or 200 of each of those first few ingredients, the milk, the sugar, and the water. I tried to make it with the original amount, that 0.459 kilos, and I had custard everywhere. I was filling up pretty much every vessel in the house I could find with custard, and of course we couldn't eat it all, so we had to throw it out, which is really, really, I hate throwing out food. From that, what I found, that balance of the 200, it gave me a perfect amount of custard to fill in 12 muffin size pastry shells. It was absolutely just spot on. Again, if you're making more than that, you can easily upscale that. But it is really important to keep, and I'll talk about this as I go through in the video, that amount of milk, sugar, and water the same. So say 400, 600, 800 of them, because otherwise the custard doesn't work. And you want to have a good thick custard for your to put in your pies. And if you have if you put too much liquid in, it's just going to be quite weak and it's not going to set. And then you end up with liquid in a pastry case, and no one loves that at all. The other thing, and this is one of those things in life that makes me really happy, was this mention of a scudella. I was like, oh, what's that? It's quite specific about what type of dish. So I typed it into Google, and I found all these examples of scudella in Portuguese museums. And this one down here is a 12th century one, which probably was a Moorish item of cooking. This one is kind of contemporary with the cookbook, so sort of 15th, 16th century, and this one is 18th century. It's a smallish dish. And the thing that made me happiest is I looked at my cupboard and I had one of these, and it looks identical to the 12th century one. And I bought this years and years ago at the Mediterranean food shop in town. So it's one of those things where you get something that continues over time. It makes me really happy. So that is a scudella. Also, literally translates to shield as well. So I'm guessing they're kind of shield-shaped dishes. It is very cool. So when I put my recipe together, I actually adapted the first thing that was the pastry was because they're not very specific about what is in the pastry at all. And I thought if I just put eggs and sugar in, you're just going to get a kind of more custard basically, and it's not going to be very nice. And it does specify a dough. So I think I took it as the period assumption that to make a dough, you need to have your basics like your flour, your sugar, your water, etc. But you should add into that the egg yolks and the sugar. So to come up with that recipe, I just used a BBC Good Food short crust pastry, and it was one of the most beautiful pastries I have ever made. I'm not particularly good with pastries. I don't love making them, but this was just beautiful to the touch with the egg yolks in it. It was silky, it was smooth, it rolled out beautifully. It was just a delight. The other important thing is all the way through this recipe, I've used unsalted butter. I think you can add some salt in, and this is a very much a Nigella kind of thing to do. But if you are putting in salted butter and then you're adding salt in, what you might end up with is far too much salt, and you really want this to be quite sweet. I think it's important that when they specify sugar, that should be a slightly sweet pastry. I didn't put in a lot of sugar. I put in a tablespoon of sugar, just to give it a little bit of sweetness. But I didn't want to put too much in because I didn't want it to be overly sweet. Because I think if you have that and the overly sweet custard, you end up with it's just too sweet overall. But no, it was absolutely beautiful to work with that pastry. For the custard, as I just talked about, having those equal the milk, water, sugar, 6 eggs rather than 12 eggs. Again, we don't want custard in every jug in the house, and just a bit of flour. And the flour helps it turn into a bit more of a batter. The last bit at the end was the butter. Now, when I originally translated this recipe ages ago, and this is that 1963 translation, it mentions putting butter on top. And I'm like, that's a bit weird, Why would you do that? What's it going to add to this? So I interpreted it as like brushing melted butter on the top. Now, then I looked at it again. I thought, and Joana looked at it again. Joana, the tutor, looked at it again. She's like, "Oh, just put a bit on top." I'm like, "Oh, I'll give that a shot," and it works beautifully. You just take a wee square of butter, again unsalted, pop it on top of the custard, and as it cooks, it helps to give that that top a bit more brown to it, and it sets the top as well a bit more nicely. And I'm just going to go back right to the front. Sorry to skip around, but if you look at your Portuguese custard tart, so the pastel de nata, you see it's got a very, very brown top on it. In Portugal, it's one of those dividing things in the nation, how brown you like the top of your nata. Do you want it really brown or do you want it lighter? And some people like it to have a really good amount of color on. And one thing you don't get in this recipe is quite the same amount of colour. Oh, you can see I've got a bit of it in some of mine, but I wouldn't have wanted to leave them in the oven much longer than that because I just don't think they would have been particularly nice. And I think because of the flaky pastry, when you've got the flaky pastry, the little edges of that sort of crisp up quite nicely. If you've got the short crust, it doesn't quite work in the same way. So I think it's one of those differences between the pastel Leite and the pastel nata is that color on the top, but putting that little bit of butter on the top does give it a beautiful finish, and you can see the color on these is quite lovely as well. You get that sort of slightly golden color, and that's in part due to the butter on the top. So it is well worth doing this part of it. They were well on to something when they did that. All right, what I think we might do now is switch to the video.
Hola! Today we are going to be making Pastéis de Leite, which are the original Portuguese custard tarts, or as one commentator describes them as the grandfather of what's now known as Pastel de Nata. The recipe itself comes from a treatise of 15th century Portuguese cuisine, which was written towards the end of the 15th century and went to Italy in the middle of the 16th century. There are two parts to this recipe, one pastry and the other one is the filling. Within the pastry recipe, now the period recipe is not all that specific about what goes into it aside from a couple of ingredients. So I have added bits to this based on the BBC short crust pastry recipe, which works quite nicely. So into it goes 225 grams of flour, 100 grams of unsalted butter, really important it's unsalted, 2 egg yolks, which are beautifully called gema in Portuguese. This is one of the additions in the period recipe, that they are very specific that you put egg yolks in and sugar. And I've got about 2 tablespoons of sugar in there. And I make this in a food processor, put in the butter and the flour first, and then add in the egg yolks and the sugar, and then add a couple of tablespoons of water just to help the whole thing stick together. So for the filling, you first take water, and you need 200 mils of water. And with the 200 mils of water, you add in 200 mils of milk and 200 grams of sugar. And it is really important that you keep the quantities of those 3 things equal all the way through, even if you're upsizing the recipe. You then take 6 eggs. The original recipe says a dozen, but that is far too many, and you'll make masses and masses of custard. And with the eggs, you want a little bit of flour. So I have now taken all of those pastry ingredients and put it in my trusty food processor and mixed it together until it forms a ball. And it's really important that it gets to this stage rather than being too crumbly, because otherwise it won't stick together. What I then do is take my pastry and wrap it up in some Glad wrap and put it in the fridge to relax. So once you have brought your water to the boil for the filling, take it off the heat and add the milk and the sugar to it. And then get a whisk and whisk them together to dissolve the sugar. And then put that to one side. You then take your 6 eggs and you break them into a bowl. Then you beat up the eggs well, as the instructions specify. And then add in the flour. Really important at this stage to make sure you don't get any lumps of flour in your eggs, so you beat it fairly quickly and fairly well. Water and sugar and milk mix on the stove, and you put it on about a mid-heat and add the mix of eggs and flour to that. Really good whisk again. And you will see that this is now cooked to a point where it is in fact custard textured, and it is important to make sure you pull it off the heat at that point in time because you don't want to overcook it, and just pop it to one side and leave it to cool before we make the pastry. It is important you get this relatively thin because you don't want people to be eating just pastry. You actually do want them to get the filling of the custard as well. So I'm going to cook these in a fairly standard muffin tin, which is a non-stick one, but I do spray it first with a bit of spray oil just to make sure it doesn't stick. And once I have done that, I will get some rounds of baking paper and I just put them into the bottom of each cup, again just to stop the sticking. So to make the rounds, I take my very high-tech mug and I use it to make a circle of pastry like this, which I then put into the muffin tin like this. So we will now that we have got a full tray, we will take these and par bake them in the oven for around about 10 minutes just to get the pastry starting to cook before we put the custard in. Now that I've got my par baked pie cases and my custard, I will now fill my pastry cases to make the tarts. I have a little ladle here which I use, very convenient for filling these. It's about 1 scoop of the ladle. Gives me enough custard for each of the wee pies. On top of each of the custard pies, I am going to put a small amount of unsalted butter, and this acts to give the tops a bit of firmness and a bit of colour. And now we will put these back in the oven until the tops are brown, which is usually around about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on your oven. As you can see, they've got a lovely colour on the top, and we'll leave them to cool for a wee bit and then take them out of the pan, and then we can eat them.
A couple of bits to note. When you're beating the eggs and the flour together, you can sieve it as well, because sometimes when you do put bits of flour into eggs, it can go a bit lumpy, and you really don't want that. So if Nigella uses a sieve, I figure we can use a sieve too. It is important to par bake the pastry first, because otherwise it can all get a bit soupy, which is not fun at all. And just you don't want to fully cook it, just get them to a point where it's sort of started to harden a wee bit, and then you can put your custard on the top and then cook them. And I mean, it's up to you how long you want to leave it in the oven. I thought that was a good point to take them out where they were. They were starting to get a wee bit of dark brown on them, which was quite nice, but they weren't quite getting to the incinerated stage. As you can see, this is our final product, and they were delicious. I think I managed to feed them to most of my household and my mundane family, and they all loved them. Just a couple of things to note there. Big thanks to Joana for her translation assistance, because she was just fantastic. And one of my Year 13 boys, I'm a history teacher, did the video editing for me.